All right. Good evening, everyone. I have the immense pleasure to moderate this conversation today. My name is Valentina Außertscheider. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Vienna in economic sociology. And tonight I get to chat with Richard Cockett, who is a journalist, historian, and academic. He was a senior editor of The Economist, the magazine, a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and has written several books, one of which we're going to talk about a bit more in detail tonight. And I am joined with Andreas Novi, professor of socioeconomics here at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, as well as the president of the Karl Polanyi Society. Tonight, we're here to discuss the key competing, if you will, Viennese school of thought, some of which are usually, summarized among Hayek and his disciples in the Austrian School of Economics, as well as those ideas that have been inspired by Karl Polanyi and his book, The Great Transformation. We're going to chat about the interpretation of these types of ideas, their historical developments, as well as what they can tell us about what we're living through today. So I'd like to start with asking Richard, you wrote this brilliant book with the title Vienna, How the City of Ideas Created the Modern World. And it's also very pretty right here. And I very much can recommend anyone who hasn't read it to actually get it and read it. What motivated this book? Why ideas and why Vienna?
Yes, that's better. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening, and thank you for moderating the discussion, Valentina. Yes. So, why did I write the book? Well, in brief, I wrote it as because a long time ago, 30, 40 years ago, I was an academic, and I was very interested in the great explosion of ideas in the 1980s, which we would call generally Thatcherism or Reaganism. And I got a academic fellowship to write a book about where those ideas came from. It was not obvious to me why Thatcherism was so kind of hegemonic by the late 1980s, swept all competing economic analyses, defeated them all in politics, and the same in America. And it wasn't very dull writing that bit before I came across Hayek and the Austrian School, and indeed many other Austrian economists, Ludwig von Mises, and then Menger, and then Gottfried Pabler, and various others, Fritz Matschluck. And they were all very important in from the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, kept that.
Schon oft seit Jahren so Sie bekommen Schreibe.
And Ronald Reagan in the United States, and then in the 1990s, that led to something called the Washington Consensus, which I'll talk about a bit later. So I did about 2 or 3 chapters on that, the Mont Pelerin Society, which was Hayek's great worldwide economic liberal think tank, which was very, very influential then in spreading the gospel of the Austrian school around the world, particularly important in Latin America and parts of Asia. And I left it at that. But then the intervening 20, 30 years, so that came out in 1994, and then I was a journalist, and I did a lot of different work on, so I wrote about advertising, I wrote about psychology, business studies, marketing, etc., etc. And well, every time I looked at a subject, I like to drill down and get to the heart of the subject. Well, every time I did that, at the bottom of the subject was an Austrian, was a Viennese, who'd either dreamt up the discipline, invented the discipline, discovered the thing I was studying. And they were usually Viennese, and they'd usually fled Vienna. And so this happened again and again and again. And the person I was doing shopping, for instance, I discovered the person who invented the shopping mall, Victor Gruen, was a Viennese, and I was doing advertising and marketing. The person who invented modern advertising, Stichter, was a Viennese. And
Ich verwende in meiner Kanzlei
modern
RZ als
marketing was another man, Eddie Bernays. Viennese. So it went on and on and on. So eventually I decided, the obvious question was why the people come from the same place. And by the same place, I don't just mean the city in general. I mean the first district. This is, as you know, it's an area like you can traverse in 30 minutes. And yet all these people who invented the modern computer, mathematics, Gödel, etc., lived and worked within that or place within about 2 generations, 1870, 1930. So it was curiosity. So lots of people have written books about big door-stopping biographies of Wittgenstein, Freud, but nobody had really looked at how they were all linked and what made them particularly Viennese. What led to this great start in the city, then abruptly stopped. So that's how I
I'm an avid reader, as well as someone who does have quite an expertise within the history of ideas, and specifically the history of ideas as it happened to be in Vienna. And well, Andreas, what is your reading of the book, and what do you make of Richard's description of these ideas during that time, specifically maybe of the Austrians, the economics?
Yeah. I'm very happy that we have this conversation. I am a Viennese, born in Vienna. I like this city, and I learned a lot when reading your book. Yeah, I mean, there were many aspects that I knew, and then I perceived, he got everything right as far as I remember. And then there are several people you described that I did not know, and the history. And so it was a really fascinating book. And congratulations for this. I was wondering how one can in such a short time write a book like this. It's a little bit a lifetime project. So there is one point, and that's why I'm so happy that we discussed. There is one point where I disagree, and that has strongly to do with this university. It's the view in economics. Yeah? And as I told you in our coffee talk last week, there is one mistake in the book which I think has implications. You have a chapter on Red Vienna and then on Black Vienna. And Black Vienna is a term more or less the conservative side of the city. Yeah? And you kind of explain to the reader, black is the color of the Nazis. Yeah? And in fact, black is the color of the conservatives in Austria. For long, there have only been reds and blacks. And the black were the political Catholics, the Christian Socials, after the war, the Österreichische Volkspartei. And in fact, in this city, unfortunately, we have two currents of fascism. First, as you said, the Austro-fascists who took power in 1934, and then the Nazi-fascists that came in 1938. Yeah? And I think that that's important for the interpretation of how to see the economists and the history of and how to evaluate economic liberalism. Right? I agree with you, and I think that's really one of the charming aspects of this city, that fin de siècle Vienna was this cosmopolitan city where people from very different, what later was called disciplines, but very different backgrounds, very different research interests came together, also very different ideologies and worldviews, and were able to talk to one another. And you have you mentioned these circles, that the economic circles that were quite famous. And indeed, before the First World War, there was the Böhm-Bawerk circle, where Mises, a radical economic liberal, and Karl Renner, Otto Bauer, the kind of Austro-Marxists who became key politicians after the First World War, who they met regular in seminars, in really having this inspiring dialogue and conversation beyond ideologies, trying to find common ground. And my argument is that changed after the First World War, and that it were the Austrians, the so-called Austrians, the economic liberals, who started to become dogmatic and started to become adherents of the anti-democratic camp, with the implications that they kind of were very favorable of ending liberal democracy in 1934. I think this is, without kind of going too quick to the current situation, I think this is really, really important when we try to understand what's currently going on with economic liberalism and this strange alliance of ethno-nationalists and economic liberals in the current Trumpian situation. That's why I think looking back and kind of evaluating, and perhaps I end with a question, because the book is also a brilliant description. You really describe in a very empathetic way very different persons. And there is only one chapter where you really become emotional. That's when it's on ethno-nationalists, and it's on Karl Lueger, and it's on the Christian socials, and the anti-Semitism and the racist that inspired Hitler, and that made that's the black side of our city. And my argument is, unfortunately, the Austrians, although they never were in the same with the same opinions, politically they were in the same boat of Black Vienna, and that's not so different from what we are living currently, which then makes the evaluation of Hayek and others a little more critical, and that's not in the book.
Yes.
I mean, would you like to respond, maybe?
Well, this is where Andreas and I disagree, because, of course, I think that the Austrian school, being economic liberals, the liberal bit there is just as important as the economic bit. I mean, and again, then you have to sort of distinguish your Austrians of the Austrian school. So there's no doubt that the leader, Ludwig von Mises, he was highly dogmatic. And would brook no argument, even with his followers and scholars in his famous seminar, which was held once every 2 weeks in the 1920s up to the mid-1930s. Hayek, who becomes the most important transmitter of Austrian school economics to London and then to America and Chicago, he leaves Vienna in 1930, and he's specifically cherry-picked by the London School of Economics to take the fight to John Maynard Keynes. And at that time, the young Keynes was sweeping all before him with his ideas of government intervention to stop or prevent the worst consequences of the economic crisis that had started in 1929 with the Great Crash. Economic liberals believed Keynesian ideas were wrong. Hayek was the most articulate advocate of those ideas. So he was benched from Vienna by an economist called Lionel Robbins. So then he was sort of transmitted to the Anglo-centric world, really for the rest of his career. And the other Austrian school economists, Matschlup, etc., they all left in the early 1930s as well. But our differences, of course, I see them as
a liberal in the fullest sense. I mean, if you look at Hayek's works, I mean, he was a liberal in the full sense. So he was for freedom, as much freedom in the economic sphere, just as he was for a lot of freedom in the social sphere as well. So they were liberal in social matters as well as in economic matters. So that, I mean, that's how I see them. So I see them very differently from you, that they therefore cannot at all be precursors for the current ethno-nationalist, the rightist turn in politics, because for me, both socially and economically, they stand for the antithesis of Trumpian politics, if I can use that shorthand, or Nigel Farage in our country, or all these other people, or the Freedom Party, etc. So, and you know, the proof of the pudding there is that, you know, Hayek and the Austrian School are no longer mentioned in rightist circles, in any of those circles, whereas, say, 20 years ago, all their think tanks pumped out endless pamphlets on what Hayek would have done. Gottfried Habler's Guide to Exchange Rate, Ludwig von Mises on the trade unions, etc., etc. So I see them very differently historically, and in a very different context. But the interesting thing is, one interesting thing to note is that, of course, the reason I think the book is hopefully is unusual is because I started this from the opposite end of everyone else doing Viennese or Austrian studies. So I got interested in Vienna because of all the people who'd left Vienna and what they did in America or Britain. So it was only subsequent to reading them I discovered, oh, he came from Vienna. And to the beginning, this meant nothing to me, in fact, before I started putting the bits and pieces together about how all these other people came from Vienna and how all these circles overlapped. So, you know, their economics was informed by membership of other circles. The great lawyer Hans Kelsen, drafter of your 1920 Constitution, he was a member of the very unusually at the Freudian Wednesday Psychoanalytic Club and gave papers there. He was a sort of unofficial member of the Vienna Circle of Philosophers, and all these different circles informed the richness of his legal thinking. So I came at it from the sort of different end, if you like.
May I? I should insist on the on the difference. 2 points. One thing is that many of the liberals in the 20s, many of the scientists, they joined social democracy. Even being quite conservative, like Sigmund Freud, Alma Mahler, I would consider them culturally liberal, really obsessed by opposition to political Catholicism and the anti-scientific attitude widespread in Christian social party. But that was not a key problem for Hayek, Maslow's, and all the others, Mises especially, because the key enemy were the socialists. And the guiding idea, and it was not the socialists, but it were the social democrats who were the main responsible also because Vienna never had a communist or Bolshevik revolution. So the social democrats were the most democratic party, or somehow, unfortunately, probably the only democratic party in the interwar period. And they were the main targets of the Austrians. And they were all, including Oskar Morgenstern, who has a square named after him in Vienna. He remained in Vienna until 1938. And they all sympathized or supported or worked together with the Christian Social Party and afterwards the Austro-fascists. And I think, and that's what the worrying thing with the economic liberals is, and where I really want to challenge you. The point is, they never fought against the communists, never. I mean, who fought against the communists economically was Keynes in the War Ministry, John Kenneth Galbraith in the War Ministry in the US, organizing the war economy. What the economic liberals always did, fighting social democracy, fighting social liberals. It started with Keynes. When Hayek, he was first called to UK to fight Keynes, which definitively is a defender of a mixed economy and a liberal Democrat. He was then called to the US and was well received by all those fighting against Roosevelt and the New Deal. So again, it was against the middle of the road politicians and economic policies. And it was never against what they self-declared, against the totalitarians. They always aimed at the middle of the road. Like in the 1970s, you can criticize the Labour Party for a lot of things until today, but Starmer is not a totalitarian. Neither were the Labour Party of the 1970s. But they were the enemies whom they fought against and defeated, and that's what I find so problematic from the standpoint of our common Hans Kelsen liberal democracy perspective.
So maybe if I could summarize these two positions in my own words and ask you whether this is the right representation. So if I understand Richard's point correctly, you're saying we can take Hayek's ideas and the Austrian School scholars' ideas as how you would read it in their books, say the Constitution of Liberty, where Hayek felt the need to even suggest that why he's not conservative, right? He wrote this epilogue, which was later edited, where he actually explicitly suggested how he's actually not a conservative, whilst actually starting the book with, my mind has been shaped by my youth spent in my native Austria, as well as my middle of my life in Great Britain. So there seems to be an implication here, right? And if I understand Andreas's point correctly, is saying we cannot distinguish, we cannot separate that ideational representation as you find them in the books from the type of political period that type of ideas came up. So I wonder, is there value in trying to distinguish and separate how Hayek wrote in his book and how Hayek was maybe politically perceived? And if so, where does this get us? Because if we were to see any value in separating a Hayek that is in the books of how we can read it and a Hayek that may be politically interpreted against socialism, if there is value in separating that, then maybe a Hayek Keynesian debate would also be a different thing. Maybe it would be a plural economist type of education that you would have found at the LSE at that point in time. So yeah, is there value in separation?
Well, yes, I mean, just quickly and come back to Andreas's last point. The thing is that Yeah, sorry. So sorry, online viewers. So the context of this, of course, very quickly switches indeed to the Cold War and the battle against communism. All these Austrians, they come to Britain and America in the late 1930s when the prime enemy is fascism and Nazism. But very, very quickly that switches. Within 5 years, the prime enemy is communism. And all their books are taken very quickly to be tracts mainly against communism. The Open Society is the classic example of that by Karl Popper, written in the early 1940s in New Zealand as a tract against fascism. That was his totalitarian enemy in the book. By the time it was published in 1945, it became popular as 1946, the totalitarian enemy was communism. And so that book is taken up by all those who want a theoretical defense of liberty and a theoretical attack on communism, which was, of course, was not Popper's intent at all. And it's very interesting. Popper and Hayek were friends. close friends, and Hayek did a lot to bring Popper to England and to get the Open Society published. But Karl Popper remains essentially a man of Red Vienna, a social democrat. He goes to Hayek's first more panorama meeting of economic liberals in 1947 and never goes again, and in fact has very little to do with Hayek's campaigns for freedom and economic liberalism ever again. And just one point on coming back to communism, because you say, Hayek doesn't campaign against communism, but Hayek's precise point in his most famous book, The Road to Serfdom, in 1944, that is, if you embarked on the Keynesian route, you would end up with a totalitarian state. And the reason, or at least approximately to a totalitarian state, and the reason that his ideas get taken up with such gusto in Britain in the mid-1970s is because many people think that by then Britain was sinking. Well, the economy was in an awful state, and you were sinking into a sort of crony communist state. The country was ungovernable. Everyone was permanently on strike, and we were basically, the famous label, the sick man of Europe, and that was directly attributable to Keynesian. So that's exactly why Hayek had the purchase that he had, and the reason Thatcher and everyone implemented, for better or for worse, a program based on Hayek was exactly to prevent the outcome of ending up in a even more deeply totalitarian and highly controlled state. So that I think it's worth making that point. I mean, I agree that you should see these people in the historical context. But interesting, of course, they often don't make the historical context. The historical context is made for them by other people. Perhaps I think Hayek probably went along too readily with people who'd opposed the New Deal in America. But I think for a person at that juncture in time, he'd published this great book. He had a platform for the first time. I think he was kind of very ready to then, broadcast his views as much as possible, and got help from any quarter he could. I basically needed money to start the Mont Pelerin Society.
Yeah, but the point is, and I think he mentions Vienna in both books, in The Road to Serfdom. It's in the book where he kind of criticizes this idea from the cradle to the grave, as being totalitarian. And we know that that's part of Austria and Viennese social democracy, that we have a quite paternalistic welfare state, which takes care of people from during the whole lifetime, with definitively also negative connotations. But on the other hand, if you compare it with many other cities, it makes a very nice place to live. If you have a public administration who cares, and for him that's totalitarian. And the point is, in the other book, The Constitution of Liberty, he explicitly says, to understand me, you have to look at how I was scared about Red Vienna in the 1920s. And that's, for me, scaring, because it denominates an apparent totalitarian enemy, which for me is the best economic form of liberal democracy that I encounter. And if we look now in the 21st century for some type of forward-looking mixed economy, it's exactly this mixture of market economy and planning as the Viennese aimed at, and having there the economic liberals as the main enemies. And that's exactly the situation we live today with an FPÖ, Freedom's Party, whose main economic politician is the head of the Hayek Institute in Vienna. So I would argue that is still quite alive, this idea of Hayek, and it's again in 100 years tradition, kind of aiming against this mixed economy, central social democratic, in the sense of Kelsian liberal democratic economic programs that they've encountered their main enemies. And yeah, I just said.
I might just say, so we're talking about the differences too, but in my mind, always the differences can be badly exaggerated. So there's the famous, as I've said, so Hayek was brought to Britain basically to argue against Keynes and the general theory, etc. But when The Road to Serfdom came out in 1944, this great blast against Keynesian economics and The Road to Serfdom, Keynes read it on a journey. He was negotiating for the British government for the foundation of the IMF and the World Bank in America at the time. And he read The Road to Serfdom on his way to the American conferences. And he wrote Hayek a famous letter about The Road to Serfdom. And that begins, I paraphrase here, marvelous book. I wholeheartedly agree with all the ideas in your book. It's a wonderful analysis of the current economy. The only place I disagree with you is where to draw the line in the economy. So, in other words, what he was saying, you can dance on the head of a pin. All they were really arguing about, in The Road to Serfdom, Hayek is quite clear that you need a safety net, that the government should provide public goods, that you should have some sort of welfare system. That's all in The Road to Serfdom, and that's exactly what Keynes wanted as well, and Beveridge and what Red Vienna provided. The difference between the two was actually highly technical. It was, where do you draw the line between providing things to people for free and disincentivizing people because you provide everything for free? That was the line. And also, if you provide all these goods, the economy becomes unproductive, and that causes inflation. Keynes's famous problem, which he ignored, asked, what would you do about inflation? His famous reply, in the long run, we're all dead, which isn't very helpful. So, but that letter pinpoints that, in fact, in terms of what we're arguing about, social democracy, I regard myself as an ordo-liberal. That's my say, as a West German social democrat with a larger dose of economic liberalism than you, perhaps. But so as just a reminder that when we're discussing these things, in fact, in terms of foundational economics, the original text, the authors often agreed with much more than they disagreed about.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I would say that's exactly why Keynes is a Democrat, and I would be very happy if the political debate on economic issues would be exactly about the topic that he mentions in the letter, because I agree that it would be very stupid because of the political criticism about Hayek to say everything that Hayek said is stupid. You can definitively learn from Hayek, and we recommend our students to read Hayek exactly for this reason. And then discuss where to draw the line between markets and planning. That's exactly the logic of a mixed economy. My point is that that's not the attitude of the other side. The attitude of the other side, and this is the logic how Mises and Hayek present this dualism, that there is no third way between either markets or planning, and if you opt for planning, you unconsciously are already on the wrong track. And this kind of very dogmatic reasoning, which you find popularized today in many quarters, this is so destructive for democracy, because once you assume that it's a tension between the two, and you have to negotiate, and people have different preferences, and that's the reality in a plural society, and that would be very fine, which is very different from the idea that once you defend in one or the other quarter planning, you are already a totalitarian.
maybe since we've now spoken quite a bit about Hayek, maybe we could also talk about the competing school, as in the Karl Polanyi view on it, as we've promised in the outline of the event. And maybe one of the things that really struck me always about the, as we call it today, the Hayek part of where once there was this notion of talking beyond ideologies, that when Hayek wrote about the necessity and the importance of local knowledge and how that complexity of social systems is really something that you cannot plan for, centrally speaking, that a lot of what Hayek is writing sounds very similar to Polanyi's embedded economy and to Polanyi's way of understanding markets as something that is deeply embedded in social relations, and how those relations ideally are the ones that define economic relations. How do we square these competing schools? Where do we find those differences? Where do they come up? And how does it, how do we end up with a reception history that brings us to a point where we see Keynes and Hayek at the two completely different end of the spheres, just like we understand Polanyi and Hayek being at completely different end of the spheres?
I think in this point we have an agreement because the book is very sympathetic with Hayek and is very sympathetic with Polanyi as well. And by the way, there is Polanyi's brother Michael, who was a friend of Hayek and a supporter of market economies. So indeed, there is common ground. And if I understand you correctly, that what you find sympathetic, you sympathize with Polanyi is exactly that he rejects this dualism of markets and planning and proposes this way of a mixed economy. And I would strongly support this idea also in to kind of orient this left-right dispute, which is in a very silly way, the political right is in favor of markets and the political left is in favor of planning, and then you have to choose one or the other. I would argue that the good way forward is exactly overcoming this dichotomy, and that we start thinking in a different way. And as I said, what I find so worrying about the economic liberals, that they are obsessed with criticizing this mixed economy and not so much whenever they criticize central planning and all this. I even have a certain understanding and agreement with the economic liberals. But that's the common ground that I see between the two of us. And that would be the common ground also because Richard's new interest is on Hans Kelsen also, which I would say that's also the common ground of my understanding of a liberal democracy, which is open to a capitalist organization of the economy, but also a socialist organization of the economy, depending how people prioritize this or that. And that would be kind of linking the Keynesian idea of people deciding on their economic constitution with the Polanyian idea that every city, every country has to find the best way of arranging and coordinating markets with other organizing principles. This is far cry from this very reductionist either-or approach of the economic liberals.
Yes, no, I agree with most of that. I mean, yes, I'm coming back to the political packages, if you like. It's striking. I always point out to my students that who do you think the first and I think still most powerful political advocate of environmentalism has ever been in politics? See if anyone's got any ideas. Who?
Sure.
Mrs. Thatcher. Hayek's greatest admirer, Mrs. Thatcher. who started the whole political movement for environmentalism, as Polanyi exactly would say, to incorporate environmentalism, climate change policies, etc., has to be embedded in all our thinking about economics. And she made a famous speech at the UN in November 8, 1989. She did 2 other speeches to the Conservative Party in October 1990, the last one before she fell, and another one to the Royal Society in 1988, where they're very well worth going back and reading. And here you have Hayek's greatest admirer saying, what is the greatest threat to humanity at the moment? It's climate change and the environment. And we have to incorporate, from now on, we have to take collective action to mitigate the effects of climate change, etc. It's gone too far. And she says that this is in the Conservative Party speech, that if the free market mechanisms have caused undue climate damage, the free market mechanisms have to go first. What we have to deal, whatever can deal with climate change, has to take precedence. So that's coming from Hayek's greatest political admirer. And I bring that up because it shows that, politics changes, a good politician responds to the concerns of the time. When Polanyi in The Great Transformation is he almost just hints at these problems, and he asks for its labor and the environment, land, etc., not to be included as items in capitalist exchange. In fact, that's exactly what Mrs. Thatcher is arguing pretty well at the UN in 1989. So once again, it's taken 50 years to get there, but eventually the political or rather the obviousness of the problem has forced itself on politicians. So again, I just warn against taking too many dichotomies here, because the reality is very different. In fact, you see a lot more agreement, even in the most startling form, i.e. Mrs. Thatcher, on a lot of these subjects than many people realize.
I wonder whether this happened to the same point of time as Elinor Ostrom started talking about the environment, and Elinor Ostrom actually ended up with this big critique of how there is not just a market or just a state solution, but it's always, a very sort of a bottom-up institution building by communities affected by, governance of the commons issues, and how she herself describes herself as a libertarian or a liberal person being inspired by Buchanan and Pollock, Hayek and Mises and that type of tradition.
I'm sorry, one thing to add to that. Of course, what made Mrs. Thatcher why she grasped the gravity of the situation is she was a scientist and she studied chemistry at Oxford. And she is today the only scientist ever to have been Prime Minister of Britain. And I think I'm right in saying one of the only scientists, Angela Merkel being the other example, of being the only scientist to be leader of a major European nation. So, and you can go back to the National Archives in Britain. She was given the chemical formulae by her great environmental advisor, Crispin Tackel. Said, look at these, this is frightening. And any other prime minister would just put it in the out tray and forgotten about it. But you can see Mrs. Thatcher's scrawl over the chemical formulas for climate change and CO2 gases is in 1989. And then she realizes actually what is happening chemically to the air and the environment. So again, it's also important what you study, what you know, your background, etc. So that's also got to be in the mix too.
Would you like to respond? No?
Yes.
Maybe we go to a less fun pickup on how it's great that there was some progressive ideas in some camps where we don't expect it so much. We have the more recent history of where libertarian and Austrian ideas has gone to, and Quinn Slobodian famously has written a book on this called Hayek's Bastards, where he writes a genealogy of how Hayek's and Mises' ideas got picked up by far-right politicians, far-right radicals in a very supportive way. So he writes about, Steve Bannon going to cite Hayek's metaphors from The Road of Serfdom, how the Swiss People's Party politician is also a member of the Hayek Society, how Peter Bohringer, who is an AfD member, Alternative for Germany, is also a Hayek Society member, and how, as Andreas said earlier already, how Barbara Kolm, who wrote the political economic program for the Austrian Freedom Party, is also the director of the Viennese Hayek Institute, and how all of them seem very, very comfortable in citing these economic ideas. And Quinzel Bodian does a great job in the book in showing how it is also the Mont Pelerin Society and these kind of communities who end up at the very far fringes of the right political spectrum. How can we square that with the reading that we have discussed now of those schools, and what do we make of them for the current political moment?
Do you want to go?
Yeah, my argument would be that unfortunately it's not so surprising for me that they are used, and then there is discussion in how far they are used or misused by Millet, Bolsonaro, Trump and others. And I found it very interesting reading Richard's book of the 90s on the think tanks. It's called Thinking the Unthinkable. And it ends with describing, first it describes how the neoliberal think tanks influenced politics and created Thatcherism and kind of inspired Thatcherism, but how little they contributed during the Thatcher government, because it was much too pragmatic and did not follow the ideology. And a little bit, we have something similar, because we also have a Trump government that many economic liberals don't like. But we have a reasoning on the state is nuisance, and it does. We have to get rid of all public institutions. We have Elon Musk taking Hayek and Mises as his kind of inspiration, Peter Thiel and many others. So one can argue and see how you will kind of argue this, that's a misunderstanding and all this, but unfortunately, there is this line of reasoning that if you look at the readings of Hayek's when he says that in 1870 the age of liberty ended, which I really found impressive, saying that was exactly when slavery ended in the US, but has not ended yet in Brazil because it only ended in 1888, when there was the Great Depression, and there is this systematic lack of empathy with the victims and losers of the system that you find in reading Hayek and Mises. And when you then listen to Musk saying that empathy is one of the key problems of Western civilization, I see a very coherent line of reasoning linking the one with the other. And this idea that we had a discussion at this university whether Mises is a fascist or not, and definitely he is not a fascist. Also, he wrote very sympathetically about fascism, and that fascism had a civilizatory mission in Italy in defeating the communists and others and reinstall order. But it was very clear that the economic liberals had no problem with dictatorships, be it Austro-fascist, be it Pinochet, and currently all the announcements done by Trump or FPÖ and others don't hinder our industrialists, for example, to support the economic liberal program of the FPÖ. So I see a continuation which has to do with this lack of empathy, with this elitist social Darwinist understanding that the selection kind of chooses the best ones, and the best ones are the Western Christian civilization, and the successful people at the top. So all these continuations really worry me with economic liberalism. Not so much this concern with individual freedom. I would say there is again a conversion between Polanyi and Hayek, that they stress that freedom is a very, very important value that has to be defended against coercion and oppression and all this. So that's not the dividing. The dividing line for me is this dogmatism and lack of empathy, which I see a line that already started in the 1920s.
Thanks, Andreas. I mean, I agree with you that, the fundamental for Hayek and the Austrian School is economic freedom. And all their arguments against collectivism are founded on, property rights, etc., as a bulwark against an over-centralizing state. That's why they insist on property rights for political purposes as much as economic. And I must say, I just don't see where Quinn Slobodian, is coming from in the book. Because as an economic, I'm an editor of The Economist, and we spend all our weeks, days and months, criticizing the Trump administration and all the new writers. I'm exhausted with adjectives and expletives, etc., to describe all the Musks and the Thiels and Trump. They all seem to be absolutely antithetical to everything economicalism stands for. Economicalisms are for, free trade, they're for freedom of movement of labor, freedom of movement of capital, they're for a rules-based order, they're for the WTO. These are exactly all the things that all these right-wing people are trampling over. So I just don't see it. As I say, I'm an economic liberal. The Economist is an economic liberal paper, and the enemy is squarely in our sights, and the enemy is squarely Trump, MAGA, and all their works, and the same with all the same sort of people in all other countries. In Britain, we've just had local elections last Thursday, which suggests Nigel Farage will probably be our next prime minister. He swept the board, so we'll then have fun taking on Nigel Farage as well. And looking at his economic and social platforms, it's a horrendous rag bag of policies, very unthought out, but typical populism. Populism is again that sort of mix of contradictory policies. That's the enemy in plain sight again. So I just don't see what Ludwig is on about.
Two comments on this. The first one is, I think that this is really the dividing line. If you are an economic liberal defending liberal democracy, I'm very happy. But it's very clear that there is a large part of economic liberals, to start from Milei and all his supporters, from Bolsonaro, which I know well, and his supporters, they are self-declared economic liberals. They have economic liberal programs of privatization, of austerity, and all this, liberating cryptocurrencies and so on. And they view liberal democracy in a very critical way. So I see this dividing line, and my argument is really trying to convince economic liberals to part companion with this group. So that's the first point. The second point, and that's the Polanyian argument, which we have talked much less about Polanyi, what he calls the liberal utopia. And in preparation of our conversation, I read it again, I don't know, the 10th time or whatever. And every time you read it again, you read other things. And now having a little more knowledge and read several texts from Mises, I have the impression that what he calls the liberal utopia is exactly the opinions of Ludwig von Mises. Somehow the blueprint that he had in mind. And his argument is that the ideas of Ludwig von Mises, the liberal utopia of a self-regulating market, is illusionary. The term utopia is meant, I think you have to read it as an illusion. There is a liberal illusion that you can create a self-regulating market and that is accepted by the people. So what was the liberal illusion in the 1930s and why Hayek and Mises and all the others were so unhappy with politicians? They suggested in a time of 25% of unemployed that the key problem is that wages have not fallen sufficiently, that unemployment still is much too low for the price mechanism to equilibrate. Obviously, Thatcher or the Christian socials did not listen to the illusionary economic liberals because they would have never been elected with such a proposal. So that's the second point. I think there is something of illusionary when you look at Hoppe. He's one of these advisors for AfD. They have so radical ideas of getting rid of the whole welfare state in Germany and all this, that AfD does not take these ideas up. But the line, the direction they are going is unfortunately exactly this dismantling of welfare institutions that are in line with economic liberalism. So that would be my second argument, where I really think that the liberal utopia is an illusion. And time and again, they come up with this idea. We have it very strongly in the public debate in Austria. We don't have sufficient austerity after 15 years of not talking about other things than reducing budget deficit. The key concern and policy debate is on austerity, not on whatever other economic problem we might have.
Maybe because we're running out of time, maybe I would ask the panelists to have a final closing statements before we open up to Q&A, if there is anything.
Well, I'll say one thing to your first point. I think where we might more agree is that I was thinking you mentioned Millet and Bolsonaro, who are Millet famously as a self-declared Thatcherite fan and economic liberal. But the reason we at The Economist, for instance, where we've always written against Bolsonaro is against Viennese very firmly, to use your Schmidt dichotomy in politics. We are friend enemy. He's very firmly is on rule of law. I think, and this comes back to Kelsen, because above all, a liberal has to believe in the rule of law. And if that doesn't work, then economic liberalism basically collapses as a system. Kelsen appreciated that, and Hayek really appreciated. That's why he spent the last year of his life writing these very large books. Law, Legislation, Liberty, which was all about the interaction between regulation, the legal order, and economic liberalism. I mean, there's a paradox there that in order for freedom to work, it has to be underpinned by a network of laws and regulations, guardrails, if you like. And of course, when Bolsonaro's supporters go and invade the Supreme Court and smash up the parliament, etc., as they did a couple of years ago, that is, the antithesis of the rule of law, and that's why we are against these populists. So I think we're probably sort of more in agreement. I mean, the enemies in many ways are the same. I was just thinking about what is it particular that that would unite these views, and that's probably it.
So on this note, I would love to ask the audience if there are any questions that you'd like for our panelists to answer. Maybe state your name and for whom the question is for. Maybe if there's, we can take one. For now, there's only 3, so we can take one per one, but I would ask for short questions and short answers.
I'll be quick. My name is Verena Madner. I'm a professor here at VU and also the vice president of the Austrian Constitutional Court. My question goes both to Richard and Andreas, but as I'm teaching and discussing with Andreas a lot, it's maybe first to Richard. I happen to know, and was mentioned that you're interested in Hans Kelsen specifically, and I would like to deepen that aspect a bit by bringing in and also learning from you, because I haven't read Hayek extensively, to put it mildly, democracy and freedom. You said in the beginning that Hayek was a liberal in the broadest sense. My understanding always was that freedom for him and democracy for him is acceptable as long as it prioritizes economic freedom. And this is definitely antithetic to what Kelsen proposed, with his relativist view that goes very well along with a mixed economy and deems it democratically legitimate to have this kind of economic planning. Whereas my understanding, and this is the question, would Hayek then be not even skeptical, even think it is an impossibility to have economic reforms or an economy that doesn't prioritize property rights and economic freedoms, a bit like the neoliberal European economic constitution that tends to prioritize this kind of property rights? Thank you.
Yes, very quickly. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is absolutely a tension between Kelsen and Hayek on this. That Kelsen, as an economist, prioritizes economic freedoms, and Kelsen, as a lawyer, prioritizes, let's say, constitutional rights, civil rights, and that is a tension that runs through those two modes of thinking, for decades afterwards, because. Again, Hayek's experience in Britain, what Keynesianism did as an economic doctrine was Democrats could use democracy basically to drive the economy into the ground. That was Hayek's basic point. So he didn't cherish democracy, and around the world he saw populist dictators using democracy to do exactly that. So there is undoubtedly a tension there, whereas Kelsen was much more interested in embodying civil rights and cultural democracy as the absolutely most fundamental thing in a nation state. But as I say, towards the end of his life, the last 20 years of his life, Hayek got much more concerned with the link between law, if you like, regulation and an economic liberty. Mrs. Thatcher used to carry around a copy of Law, Legislation and Liberty and slam it down on the table when anyone was questioning her and said, this is what we believe. And if you talk about, all the Thatcherite reforms and privatization, et cetera, but they came with a huge amount of secondary legislation, law, in order to make sure that all this work, that you didn't have private monopolies, that the benefits of this was distributed, that you had every sector had regulatory authorities set up. For instance, Media and Communications has the Office of Communications, which is a very well large staffed organization which regulates all these industries. So the economic liberals in Britain, the Thatcherites, etc., didn't just throw everything open for a free-for-all. In fact, what evolved was a very regulated, tightly regulated sectors where companies were privately owned, but they were very regulated in what they could do, say in broadcasting, what they could broadcast, who could own them, how the share ownership could be distributed, when they were allowed to broadcast, when they weren't allowed to broadcast. And, these regulatory agencies have very, very strong powers to shut entire industries down. So I think it's a sort of myth that the Hayekians, the economic liberals, were for economic freedom at the expense of everything else. In fact, if you look at in detail at what they constructed, it's, as I say, it's a very much a different story.
Andreas, would you like to add anything? Later. Okay, then we have second question, a third, and then a fourth here. Yeah, we can still go question by question.
Thank you. My name is Michael Stampfer. I have, it's hard for me to confess in this room today that I read A Great Transformation only 2 years ago. But the good thing is that one thing got stuck in my memory, that Polanyi tells us how quasi-religious some of the beliefs of the 19th century economists and politicians and policymakers were, like the gold standard or deflationary politics and what you also described. So is it possible to think that the Austrian economists were so much in favor of some political or economic beliefs that they would have sold out to everybody who helped them to fulfill these kind of promises, like the consensus of the 20s also, and they didn't look too sharply to the downsides of those whom they offered their know-how and their sympathies. Is that some approach which could be possible also in the light of the Great Vienna history?
Yeah, sure. The short answer would be yes. The first thing is I agree. Before I disagree, I agree that you correctly argue that Polanyi and Hayek are socio-economists, that they understand the market as related to society and law and not disconnected. But the point is that when preparing me for today, if you really look at stronger in Mises, but very present in Hayek as well, they have a belief system, a very strong belief system, and that the belief system is that property rights and markets create the best society. And as long this is guaranteed, democracy is fine, peace is fine, and you find a lot of citations in the book that they are strong defenders of cosmopolitan world order, peace, democracy. But the moment that property rights and markets are questioned, it's war, and everything is permitted. And that's really the dangerous aspect, and that's the Mises citation on fascism. He does not like fascism, but as the communists in Italy in the 20s endangered property rights and the markets, the war made it necessary to ally with whoever was on the side of property rights and markets, and in this occasion, it were the fascists. So it's this belief system, and that's the same with the anti-Semites, the Christian social anti-Semites in Austria, and the political Catholicism that was very strange to Ludwig von Mises, who was a Jew, and kind of suffered from anti-Semitism and no sympathy culturally. But if there is a war between social democracy, who wants to limit property rights and the market, then it's very clear. And I would argue there is this Schmittian notion in Hayek and Mises. And you have to answer this question, if you look at the Constitution of Liberty, he has a whole chapter, Hayek, dedicated to criticize Hans Kelsen, exactly for being sympathetic to political liberalism. undermining economic liberalism. And he has a footnote, and that's Hayek. He has a footnote in 1960 being very sympathetic of Schmidt. Because if it's we and the others, the Schmittian ideology is compatible with a reading of Hayek done by Millet or Bolsonaro and others. Yeah? So I would strongly agree with this. And here again, the way forward proposed by Polanyi in this sense is really the much more modest way of kind of judging in each situation what's the best way forward without exactly knowing it. So it's a much stronger commitment to democracy in this sense.
Okay, we have another 3 questions in the room. So first, the gentleman at the very back, then the third row, and then the first row. And I would suggest we collect them and then have 2 statements. Please, brief questions, brief statements, and then we can see whether we can have another round of questions.
Yeah. Joachim Becker, pensioned professor here at the Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien. And I would like to come back to the question of democracy. And I would argue that Mises and Hayek were quite uncomfortable with the end of the empire for 2 reasons. One, the rise of ethno-nationalism, and the second, the rise of democracy. And especially the expansion of the realm where democratic decisions can be taken, like social rights. And in a certain way, the Constitution of Liberty is about reducing the realm of democratic rights, of a limited democracy, and also of limiting suffrage. Yeah? And Richard mentioned also Neurath as an antagonist of Mises and Hayek. And I would argue that the conception of planning of Neurath also implied democratic planning. Yeah? So also the issue of democracy. Not technocratic planning, but democratic planning. And he also argued that the market has limits, and that the calculus has limits, and therefore political decisions have to be taken about qualitatively different alternatives. Yeah? And today we have the discussion about ecological decisions to be taken, and that would also be a question of democracy. So how would you see that relationship of democracy and Hayek, Mises, and also question of ecology that you also mentioned?
Melina?
Thanks. Paul Chatterton is my name, and I'm totally ignorant of this field, not having read any of these works. So apologies for my question, but I'm struck by the fact that these are 2 poles of a very rationalist world. And my question is, how relevant are they in a world of Trump and Orban, which does not seem to be rationalist? It's about creating a kleptocracy that removes rationality and control. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Silvia Nosek. I'm head of the 18th district here in Vienna. So I'm a politician on a local level, struggling every day with the challenges of climate change. As I want to relate to your story about Margaret Thatcher and her sustainable turn in the end of her political career. You said that it's the responsibility of a good politician to react when one has been wrong. And I think and even the strong responsibility is to be aware that as a politician you form discourses in society. And I think I heard this for the first time about Margaret Thatcher, but hearing this I would say it's tragic that she was one of the most important politicians to form a societal discourse, an atmosphere that about there is no such thing as society or there is no alternative, that makes it now nearly impossible to do the things we had, which would be necessary on a level of laws, of restrictions, of that. And I think in history it might be tragic about this liberal utopia that there are outcomes where then the liberals say, "Oh, that we didn't want that." For example, fascism, and I think everybody would say, and the liberals, "No, we don't want climate catastrophes." But could it be that these outcomes are consequences of this idea of markets, free markets can find solutions for everything and the best solutions?
Maybe Richard, would you like to start?
Yes, I could do two and three quickly. Two, yes, it's fascinating, and I do address this in the book, because the enemies of Red Vienna, I call it progressive Vienna, they had their leader was, in the university, was a very conservative philosopher called Ottmar Spann, now completely forgotten. But in his day, in the 1920s and 30s, he was in fact the most famous professor at the University of Vienna, and had a kind of strong coterie of students, one of whom, in fact, was early Hayek. And it was Spann specifically argued for a new, he actually called it an anti-rational politics. He thought rationalism, Vienna, had gone too far and had resulted in a sort of sterile, what he meant, it had resulted in Jewish science. That's what he meant. And by that was a shorthand for a progressive, rationalist, cosmopolitan science, where everything was evaluated by means of science in the broadest sense, statistics, etc., which were taught by highly educated people who had all the advantages in Vienna. So it was a sort of coded attack. But that is, from that, you can trace the roots of Trumpism absolutely to today. There's a direct line from Ottmar Spann, the politics of, he actually calls it anti-rationalism, and rationalism has gone too far, to the politics of the shorthand, the politics of feeling. So the argument of Spann was that by concentrating on the rational and the mind, we've neglected the politics of feeling. And what he meant by that, the politics of blood and soil, of nation, of patriotism, of values, of rural values, etc., etc. You're all familiar with all this. And so what he did was to posit a politics of rationalism and a politics of feeling, a very, very dangerous divorce in philosophy, because, of course, what Freud was doing, Freud was denounced as a scientist, a Jewish scientist, inventing a Jewish science. What Freud was doing, of course, was to try to match science with feelings. He was doing nothing else but analyzing conscious or unconscious feelings. That's what he was about. But what the enemies of progressive humane Vienna did was to divorce the two one from another, and therefore undermine the whole basis of Red Vienna and scientific Vienna. And what I do in my book, we sit here arguing about the relative merits of Keynes, Hayek, and Kelsen and Polanyi. What I say, the big thought I take away from all this is that they are all on the same side, that they are rationalists. They are using science, the tools of modern rationalism and thought to tackle real issues. They are on the same side. Ottmar Spann, Trump, etc. They are on the other side. They are the anti-rationalists. They are consciously using Bannon, all these people, the politics of feeling, appealing to, in the end, prejudice and all those sort of qualities against the politics of rationalism. That, for me, is the real division, and that is the tragedy of Vienna, is that while they were having these great debates, these nice debates in their circles about, how much should economic liberalism, should we be on the gold standard or not? In fact, they missed the far bigger debate, which was swept them aside in 1934. And very quickly on Mrs. Thatcher, I'll give you a thought experiment. So Mrs. Thatcher, having made those speeches, she was then offered the post of the UN's first climate czar, special representative, after she'd left office in about 1993. And she seriously considered taking up the post. So now it's almost unimaginable, Mrs. Thatcher as the UN's first climate representative. And she toyed with it for quite a long time, and then decided she was too engaged with trying to destroy the European Union. So she preferred to do that. But it would have been absolutely fascinating to see her in action and to see whether you're absolutely right, whether there was any way she could reconcile what she was famous for, the belief in economic liberalism, free markets, rolling back the state, etc., and her belief that climate change demanded, and this is the word she used, collective action. So that would have been a fascinating experience, but we never got to see it.
I will start with trying to answer your question. As you mentioned, Orban, and in fact, Orban was, and reflecting on Orban was for me a very helpful exercise. Because when I looked at Orban, got elected, it's very clear on the political right. So he is anti-socialist. So that was, until here, the story would be very easy. But then why he has such an obsession with Soros, and he became very strongly anti-liberal, in the liberal elite. And how can you be anti-socialist and anti-liberal? How is this possible? Because they are apparent exactly the opposites. And then I started to look at Vienna in the 1920s, where I also had this old idea that you had the political right and the political left, and it was in this case strongly a class struggle, between kind of those who have more and those who have nothing or very few resources. But if you look in detail, it was much more the 1920s, and you mentioned it in the book. The Social Democrats called themselves New Vienna, and the idea was that rationality, or deliberation, planning, we can create a society and a city for all, based on science, based on the best of our knowledge and the creativity of our people. And it were the Christian socials who called them Red Vienna. It was, at the beginning, it was a denunciation as an ideological project. That was the intention of Red Vienna. Only later on, Social Democrats became proud of being called Red Vienna, and until today, everybody calls it Red Vienna. But in fact, it was the New Vienna, and it was an alliance not only of social democracy, of the trade unions, of the workers' organizations, but it was a large part of the liberal Vienna, which sympathized, because it was strongly Jewish, sympathized with social democracy because they were aware of the old Vienna, the Black Vienna, the political Catholic Vienna. And once you perceive this, it was a very similar political spectrum as we have it today. And that was that's why I'm so interested and obsessed with understanding the 1920s, because you really have a very similar divide and a very worrying divide between, call it the old and the new, or the a strange alliance of social democrats and Freud, and all other rich people which were not kind of workers, but they were in favor of science and they were in favor of the equality, idea of equality and progress. So that's the answer, and that's why I think it's beyond those interested in history and in economics. It's a very relevant, politically and culturally relevant topic we are discussing. That relates to the issue of democracy, which was raised by Joachim, and it relates to the question of collective action, which is undermined by exactly this anti-socialist, anti-liberal alliance all over the world.
Unfortunately, or not unfortunately, it was a great conversation, but unfortunately we ran out of time now. And I would like to ask the audience to join me in a round of applause for these great two speakers.
Cheers.
And as a little event recommendation for the end, there is an online webinar happening on the 18th of May to do with the global finance and fascism yesterday and today, joined by Anne Petitfort and Bruno De Conti. So you're all very invited if this is of interest. Again, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much for listening to this great conversation, for asking these brilliant questions. And again, to Andreas and Richard for this wonderful ideas that were exchanged in the new Vienna and the new competing ideas of Vienna. Thank you so much.
And to Valentin. Yeah, I started this.